Welcome, everyone, to our session on the GBVIMS Intake Form. You will all have your own intake form that's been customized for your context. Feel free to refer to that as we go through this session together and talk about the different sections of the intake form. The data collected on the intake form is broken down into several sections. There's an administrative section, survivor information, details of the incident, alleged perpetrator information, planned action taken or referral pathways, and an assessment section. So what is the intake form? It's a standardized form that's used by service providers when conducting the initial intake interview with GBV survivors. It ensures client confidentiality by eliminating the use of identifiable information, and it ensures service providers are consistently collecting a standardized set of key GBV data points. Where does the intake form fit within the case management process? First, the survivor is going to meet with the caseworker. The caseworker completes an assessment form while they're meeting with the survivor or after the survivor leaves. The action plan may also be developed at that time with the survivor. After the survivor leaves, the caseworker will complete the data collection or the intake form, and data entry staff will enter it into the database. That's either data entry staff or the caseworker themselves. This will depend on how you organize the process in your specific context. The point here is that when you're meeting with the survivor, you're not going to be filling out the intake form. You'll do your assessment as per normal case management processes, but after the meeting, be sure to fill out the data on the intake form outside of the meeting with the survivor. How can an incident of GBV be reported? Remember that GBVIMS data is only based upon information collected in the context of service provision. That means that the survivor must be present and receiving a service in order for an incident to be reported and recorded. Some other key points to remember. Again, this is for service provision only. You're using the intake form only in the context of providing case management services to survivors of GBV. Survivor well-being is paramount. The survivor's safety, comfort, and well-being should be the priority throughout the entire process. On the intake form, you're only going to select one answer for each question. So you'll select only one box for each data point on the intake form. So before I go to the next slide, I want to have you think about where names might go on the intake form. I hope you were thinking there should be no names on the intake form, because that is correct. We do not record a survivor's name on an intake form. The intake form, like I said, has 6 sections. There's the administrative section, which is where we'll record codes and dates. There's the survivor information section where we'll record demographic details. There's a section to record the details of the incident, a section for alleged perpetrator information, a section where we have planned action and action taken or identifying referral pathways, and a point for assessments. First, we're going to talk about the administrative information that we collect. And I started to allude to this when I said that there are no names on the intake form. Instead, we have codes. There's 3 codes that will be recorded: the incident code, the client or survivor code, and then your staff code. I'll go into those codes and how we identified and create them further into this session. Next, you'll have the report date. This is the date of the initial intake with the survivor. So this is the date where you first meet with the survivor and go through the intake process. The incident date, which can be estimated if necessary, is the date that the GBV incident occurred. You have the report by client, and this is really just ensuring and marking that the incident was recorded when the survivor was receiving the service and therefore present at the time of the report. So we're recording that in the administrative information section. Then we have the client information. This is going to be where we record the date of birth of the survivor, which can be estimated if necessary, where we record the biological sex. So this is not gender, but sex, which records male, female, or other. You have the country of origin, the current civil or marital status of the survivor. There's a data point on the displacement status at the time of report. So these are standardized responses as a part of GBVIMS. And the displacement status at the time of the report can be an internally displaced person, a returnee, a resident, a refugee, an asylum seeker, a stateless person, or a foreign national. I'm going to go into those definitions here, and there's often a lot of questions about this. These are really broad identification classifications for displacement status, and I know that there are nuanced forms of displacement, but the idea is that those will fit within these categories. So if there are any questions about that, please reach out to your program coordinator or me to help you identify how you could classify displacement status at time of report. So an asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking international protection. In countries with individualized procedures, an asylum seeker is someone whose claim has not yet been finally decided on by the country in which he or she has submitted it. So not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but every refugee is initially identified as an asylum seeker. A foreign national is a person present in a country who does not currently have the right to permanent residency of that country. So maybe it's someone who's come to the country where you're operating for work. Internally displaced persons, or IDPs, are people who have been forced to flee their homes as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, internal strife, systematic violations of human rights, or natural or man-made disasters, and who seek protection elsewhere within their country of origin or residence and have not yet crossed internationally recognized state borders. A refugee is a person who is outside his or her country of origin or habitual residence and has well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion, and is unable or unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country or to return there for fear of persecution. Refugee is a legal term, and it is a legal status, and I think that that's important to note here. A returnee is a former refugee or displaced person or internally displaced person who returns to their country or area of origin, whether spontaneously or in an organized manner. And a resident is a person who has never been displaced from their home as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, internal strife, systematic violations of human rights, or natural or man-made disasters. And a stateless person is a person who, under national laws, does not have the legal bond of nationality with any state. Article 1 of the 1954 Convention relating to the status of stateless persons indicates that a person not considered a national or citizen automatically under the laws of any state is stateless. So we're going to go through some examples and try to identify how you would classify the displacement status at the time of report. In this first example, Ozma is forced to leave her village in order to escape escalating violence. She goes to her brother's house in the capital. Based on the definitions that we just discussed, how would you identify Ozma's displacement status? If you're thinking to yourself, IDP, you would be correct. IDPs are people who've been forced to flee their homes as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, internal strife, systematic violations of human rights, or disasters, and who seek protection elsewhere within their country of origin or residence and have not crossed internationally recognized state borders. Great job. All right, let's go to example 2. Aisha tells you that she has asked for international protection from UNHCR. She says they've not yet given her an answer about her case. How would you classify Aisha's displacement status? If you said asylum seeker, you are once again correct. An asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking international protection, but who has not yet had a final decision made on their claim. Again, not every asylum seeker will ultimately be recognized as a refugee, but every refugee has initially been an asylum seeker. And then finally, Aaliyah is Colombian. She decides to take a job offer in Peru in order to avoid being forced to marry. While she's in Peru, she seeks psychosocial counseling. What is Aaliyah's displacement status? If you said that Aaliyah would be considered a foreign national, you're correct. A foreign national is a person present in a country who does not currently have the right to permanent residency of that country. Also on the intake form, you're going to see a question about displacement status. It asks, is the survivor a person with disabilities? Here we're going to answer yes or no. This is focusing on function over classifying impairment, which is a best practice for data collection in GBV. So instead of determining what type of disability someone has, we are just focusing on function. So yes or no will be your answers. This is based on the Washington Group questions. People who answer yes throughout the questions of the Washington Group short set, which we'll go through, to one or more questions are considered a person with disabilities. Disability status is really important to collect as data to have an understanding of access, how services are responsive or not to people with disabilities. This really helps us understand gaps in our programming. I'm going to give a brief introduction to the Washington Group questions as a part of this session. They're really important to understand, but for now, you need to know that for the intake form, again, we're focused on function over classifying impairment. The Washington Group short set is a set of questions designed to identify in a survey format a person with a disability. Consistent with the purpose of the Washington Group questions, these are people at greater risk than the general population for participation restrictions due to the presence of difficulties in 6 core functional domains, if appropriate accommodations are not made. The questions ask whether people have difficulty performing basic universal activities like walking, seeing, hearing, cognition, self-care, and communication. And they were originally designed for use with general populations. The set is comprised of questions, again, on 6 core functions, the ones that I mentioned, and the introduction is to be read before these questions are administered as a part of case management. The introduction goes like, The next questions ask about difficulties you may have doing certain activities because of a health problem. Do you have difficulties seeing even if you're wearing glasses? Do you have difficulty hearing even if you're using a hearing aid? Do you have difficulty walking or climbing steps? Do you have difficulty remembering or concentrating? Do you have difficulty with self-care, such as washing all over or dressing? And when you're using your mother tongue or your typical language, do you have difficulty communicating? For example, do you have difficulty being understood by others? Each question is going to have 4 response categories, which will be read after you ask each question. And those response categories are no, no difficulty, yes, some difficulty, yes, a lot of difficulty, or I can't do that at all. Because of the complexity of disability, the questions were not designed to measure all aspects of difficulty in functioning that people may experience. But again, those domains of functioning that are likely to identify a majority of people at risk of participation restrictions. The Washington Group short set does not identify particular health conditions or diagnostic categories, but rather captures the possibility. There are videos specific to this, and I can share those with you. But for the purposes of the intake form review, I'm going to move forward. The next question on the intake form is asking about separated children. Separated children are children who are separated from both parents or from their previous legal or customary primary caregiver, but not necessarily from other relatives. These may therefore include children accompanied by other adult family members. Unaccompanied children and minors are children who have been separated from both parents and other relatives and are not being cared for by an adult who, by law or custom, is responsible for doing so. So on the intake form, you'll be asked about unaccompanied or separated children, and this is where you would mark either of those. Next, you have the stage of displacement at the time of incident. So we talked about the stage of displacement or the displacement status at the time of report, and that's different from this question here. So this is going to identify the stage of displacement that the survivor was experiencing when the act of violence occurred. The options for this are not displaced or that they're in their home community. This would be a person who, at the time of the incident, has never been previously displaced due to the effects of armed conflict, internal strife, systematic violations of human rights, or natural or man-made disasters. Pre-displacement would indicate that the incident occurred prior to the time that the client was displaced from their home. During flight indicates that the incident occurred while the person was traveling from their home to their place of refuge. During refuge indicates that the violence occurred during the period of time when the person was displaced. This includes both internally displaced people as well as asylum seekers and refugees. And then during return or transit means that the violence occurred while the person was returning back to their home from their place of refuge. And finally, you have post-displacement, which indicates that the incident occurred after the client returned home from their displacement. So this timeline kind of visualizes what I just said, where the act of violence occurred either in their home community, so they were not displaced, or it occurred prior to displacement, during refuge, during the act of returning to their country or residence of origin, and post displacement. So hopefully this visual helps you map that timeline. We're going to go through some examples here, again, to identify how you would classify these incidents of violence and the stage of displacement at the time of violence. So Aisha was raped in Ciudad de Juarez, her hometown. 1 week later, she was forced to leave because of the violence. How would we classify her stage of displacement at the time the incident occurred? This is pre-displacement. Aisha ended up being displaced, but the act of violence occurred before she left. Farah is displaced by rebels fighting in her hometown. On her way to the border, she was physically abused by police. How would you classify the stage of displacement at the time of incident here? This is during flight. So Farah is being displaced and she's actively on her way to a place of refuge when the violence occurred. And that's why you would classify it as during flight. All right, one more example. Abia is finally able to return home to her home country of Mexico after living in a refugee camp for 3 years. After arriving safely back home, she's sexually abused by soldiers. How would you classify the stage of displacement at the time of incident here? Because Abia has experienced the entire scope of displacement and has finally returned home, it would be post-displacement. The next question on the intake form is about the time of day the incident took place. Here you can mark morning, which would be considered sunrise to noon, afternoon, which is noon to sunset, evening or night, which is sunset to sunrise, or unknown or not applicable. Then there's going to be a question on the incident location, or where did the incident take place? This, you'll have a list of incident locations on your intake form that's been customized for your setting that you would choose from. On the intake form, there's going to be an option for a survivor's place of residence or the perpetrator's place of residence. What would you mark if the incident of violence happened in a home that's shared by the survivor and the perpetrator? What's the difference between the survivor's home and the perpetrator's home when it's shared? And this instance, which is an instance you'll likely come across because of intimate partner violence, you're going to mark the incident location as the survivor's home. This is because it indicates that the survivor is at heightened risk of GBV in their own living space. It's emphasizing the survivor, it's centering the data on their experience, and it's emphasizing their everyday risk. So if it's a shared home between the survivor and the perpetrator, and the incident took place in that shared home, you would mark survivor's home as the incident location. There are also questions on the intake form about the broader geographical incident location. You're going to have the incident area and sub area. And again, these are customized on the intake form based on your context and your location. Incident area is going to be a larger geographic area. This could be a country, it could be a region, it could be a province. And the sub area is going to be a smaller geographic area within the incident area. So this could be a city, it could be a town, it could be a refugee camp, but it should not be smaller than 100 families. If you have a sub area that's especially small, there's a chance that that could make the data, even in aggregate reported, identifiable. So it's a rule of thumb not to include sub areas that are smaller than 100 families. On the intake form, there's a question asking if this was a harmful traditional practice or a locally contextualized form of violence. Examples of this could include early marriage, it could include forced pregnancy or forced abortion, it includes breast ironing. This again will be contextualized for your specific context and where you would mark that here. There's a question on were money, goods, benefits, and or services exchanged in relation to this incident? And here you would just mark yes or no. There's a question on the type of abduction that took place at the time of the incident. The answer might be none. It could be forced conscription, which means that the survivor is being forced to join an armed group against their will. It could be trafficking, which we define as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat of use or force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. It's a long definition, but trafficking is a complicated issue. If you need a copy of that definition, let me know and I can be sure to get that to you. Then there's an option to select other abduction or kidnapping, which can be marked if any other form of abduction or kidnapping was reported by the survivor. There's a question as well on if the client reported the incident anywhere else. And this is helpful when it comes to making sure that data collected and reported is not duplicative. So here you can say no, the client has not reported this incident of violence anywhere else. If she has reported the violence elsewhere, you can mark this as yes to a non-GBVIMS organization. So this means that she may have reported it to an organization that is not recording the data in the GBVIMS, therefore it would not be duplicative. So this might be a health facility, for example, or maybe she's reported it to the police. These would be non-GBVIMS organizations. Or you could mark yes, the survivor has reported this to a GBVIMS organization. This would be another organization using GBVIMS. So maybe the survivor has gone to another case management office in the area that's using GBVIMS and reported the incident there, but for some reason is now coming to you to seek services. This means the incident would not be recorded in our analysis, again, to avoid duplicative data reporting. If it's marked, it's automatically excluded from the statistics produced by the incident recorder. There is a question here too on if the survivor has had any previous experience of GBV perpetrated against them. You can respond no, no other notes are needed for this questions, or yes. And here you can include a brief description for your case management purposes to understand how GBV has impacted the survivor over time. Then we move into the section on the perpetrators. There's going to be a question on perpetrators on the intake form that's specific to the primary perpetrator. A primary perpetrator is the person or people that directly inflicted the violence or abuse against the survivor. Secondary perpetrators are the person or people who did not directly commit the violence against the survivor, but they played an indirect role in the violence through planning, instigating, ordering, or aiding in the planning, preparation, or execution of the abuse. So information on the alleged perpetrator includes the number of perpetrators. You can estimate this if necessary. If the exact number is unknown, but the survivor knows that there were more than 3, you would select more than 3, not unknown. Here's where you would record the sex of the primary perpetrator or perpetrators and the age group, which you can estimate if necessary. There's a question that asks you to identify the relationship between the alleged perpetrator and the survivor, if there is any, and this pertains to the one primary perpetrator. For this, be as specific as possible. Read the options from the top to the bottom and select the first option that applies. There's a question also on the alleged perpetrator's occupation, and you want to be as specific as possible. Read through the options and select the main occupation of the primary perpetrator. If none of the occupations apply, you can select other and specify there. Then there's a section on planned action or actions taken on the intake form. And this is going to ask questions like who referred the client to you? Where did you refer the client? And what services did you provide? As a response to who referred the client to you, one of the options is self-referred. I like to explain what self-referred means because I think it can be a little bit confusing. So if a survivor is self-referred to your program, this means that you're the first point of contact. If you're the first service provider the survivor has come to pertaining to the incident, then you'd select this option. So even if a friend told the survivor about your program and then they came to you to seek out services, you would still select self-referred because you're the first point of service contact. So that means that it's not coming from a formal referral from, for example, a health provider or a partner. If you have more questions on that, please do reach out. There's always the gbvims.com website as well that goes through these pieces of information in further depth if you have questions outside of these videos. Then there's a series of questions about the referrals that took place as a part of case management. So you'll be asked, did you refer the survivor to a safe house or shelter? Did you refer the survivor to health or medical services? Did you refer them to psychosocial services? Does the client want to pursue legal action? Did you refer the survivor to legal assistance services, to police or other type of security actors? Did you refer them to livelihood programs, or did you refer them to child protection services? You'll select the answer that matches your action. If you've referred the client to a service, you'll simply select yes. If you select no for the questions about referrals to various services, you need to select an explanation. This is really, really important for our analyses to identify what referral pathways exist, where there's gaps in referral pathways, what referrals are successful, what barriers are in place. So the reason for these no's, again, are really important to identify and record. So maybe you selected no because the service was already provided by your agency. Maybe you said no because the service was already received from another agency. So maybe the survivor has already gone and received health and medical care, so the referral was not needed. Maybe the service was not applicable. You wouldn't have referred a survivor to child protection case management if they're not a child and if there are no children in their lives impacted by the act of violence. Maybe the survivor did not want the referral. So maybe they needed a safe house referral, but they didn't want it. You would indicate that. And then finally, maybe the survivor wanted the referral and it was applicable, but there was no service available. Maybe they wanted and needed livelihoods programs, but in your context, there is no livelihood program. Here you would select that. That is, again, really important to indicate because it's a big advocacy point when it comes to advocating for programming and funding. So I mentioned the codes at the beginning, if you remember many minutes ago, that I wanted to go into a little bit deeper. That's the staff code, or you as a caseworker, your code, the incident ID code, and the survivor's code. These codes ensure confidentiality while also making sure you keep track of incidents and clients. So we're going to start with the staff code. This is assigned to every caseworker to protect them from being directly linked to specific cases. The code can be written in this data field to keep track of who conducted the interview and provided the service to the survivor. So an example might be just the letter B and the number 5. One staff person gets one code, and that code is for life. You only get one code, and it will be your code forever. You will not get a new code, and no one else will get your code. So if I get the code B5, I'm a caseworker, I leave the organization. Maybe there was funding cuts and I was laid off. But then I come back to the organization once funding has been reinstated. I still have the same code. Maybe I'm promoted and I go from being a caseworker to a supervisor. My staff code will still be B5. Then you have the incident ID. Every incident has a unique incident ID. This code is required for the GBVIMS. It provides the basis for organizing information in the system. A unique code is assigned to every incident that's reported, even if the same survivor reports more than one incident. Each new intake form completed has a new incident ID. I think something helpful here is to think about a case file. You have an actual file for a survivor that has those case management forms, their action plans, their assessment forms, their safety plans. And each intake is a reported GBV incident. And each reported GBV incident needs a unique code within that case file. So the incident ID is created based on a formula that your specific office will create. In Columbia, we have already gone through this process, and I can pull up some of the guidance on this to share if needed. So the incident ID in this example is made up of the organization's code, the site code, the staff code, and the incident number. So let's say that your organization's code is M, your site code is F, your staff code is B5, and the incident number is going to be sequential. Using the formula on this slide, let's come up with the incident ID for the 16th survivor reporting to our organization. The answer would be, I'm going to use my laser pointer here, M, F, B5, 016. That would be the incident ID for your 16th reported incidence of GBV. All right, we're going to try another. Let's say your organization code is F, you're in Site A, and your staff code is N3. And the incident that you're recording is the 27th survivor reporting to you at your organization. If you, in your head, or maybe you wrote it down, came up with the incident ID FAM3027, you got that exactly right. Congratulations. Next, we have the survivor code. This is assigned to each survivor to keep their identity protected. It allows multiple incidents reported by the same survivor to be linked and tracked for case management purposes. This is the only connection in the database, in the incident recorder, between the case management section and the incident reporting section. To come up with the survivor code, again, you'll decide on a formula with your country programs team. You'll collect the necessary information with the survivor on the back of the consent form. The consent form needs to be stored separately from the case file because it does have identifying information such as names. And therefore, the identifying information should be maintained on the consent form and stored separately, again, from the case file. So, with the survivor code, if we're using the formula that we have on the screen, we'll count to the first letter of each response and circle that response. Then put all of the circled letters together in order. So for example, a young woman named Fatima, who is the youngest of 3 daughters to her mother, was born in Ciudad Juarez and is 35. What would her code be? If this is the first letter of the mother's name, which I didn't mention until just now, is Maria, and she was born in Ciudad Juarez, and she's the youngest of 3 daughters and is 35 years old, we need to do some thinking, right? The first letter of the mother's name, M. Fatima, the survivor, is the 3rd daughter, so we would use the number 3. The letter of the name of the city, we would use J for Juarez, or maybe, again, this is something that you would work with your supervisor to determine. And if they're 35, they were born in the year, oh, we would need to do some math for that, wouldn't we? I believe they would be born in the year 89. So that's all to say the survivor code would then be M3J89. This, again, we have guidance on and can share outside of the space, but it's important to go through as an overview on the intake form because it is an essential part of our data collection and tracking process for the intake form itself. Thank you so much for being here for the video on the intake form. In the next session, we'll discuss the classification tool.